All right, everybody, welcome back. Today, we're going full throttle into the world of the Hells Angels.
Really diving in deep.
Exactly. And we've got an incredible guide for this journey. Hunter S. Thompson's book. What was it called again?
Hell's Angels, a strange and terrible saga. Quite a title, right?
Definitely sets the tone. And for those who maybe haven't encountered Thompson before, he's known for his, what do they call it, gonzo journalism?
Gonzo, yeah. He was all about immersing himself in the story.
And in this case, that meant living with the Angels for a whole year, riding with them, partying with them.
He even says they stomped him at one point.
Yikes. So yeah, this isn't some detached academic study. This is raw, personal, up close and personal.
It gives a really unique perspective, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And it captures a specific time and place, the 60s, this era of huge cultural shifts.
Totally. But before we get too deep into Thompson's experiences, maybe we should back up a bit.
Here's some context.
Yeah, like how did a group like the Hells Angels even come to be in the first place?
Right. So picture America right after World War II.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You have all these veterans coming home. Some are struggling to readjust to civilian life.
Makes sense. They've seen a lot.
Exactly. And for some, motorcycles become this symbol of freedom, this way to recapture that sense of excitement and brotherhood they felt during the war.
I can see that. The open road, the wind in your hair. It's almost a classic American image.
It is. And then you have pop culture starting to reflect and shape this image. Think about movies like The Wild One.
Oh, yeah, with Marlon Brando. Super cool, super rebellious.
Exactly. It provided a blueprint, almost a self-fulfilling prophecy for these early biker gangs. The imagery was there, and some people decided to live up to it.
So it's not just a random bunch of guys on bikes. There's this whole cultural backdrop. But what about the Hells Angels specifically? What made them different?
Well, this is where Thompson gets really interesting. He makes this connection between the Angels and the history of, well, he calls it white trash migration in America.
That's provocative.
It is. He uses this character, Dove Linkhorn, from a book called A Walk on the Wild Side by Nelson Algren, as kind of an archetype.
An archetype for
For the kind of people who end up becoming Hell's Angels, people on the fringes of society, constantly moving, scraping by, doing whatever they have to survive, and often getting demonized for it.
Okay, I see where he's going with this. But it also sounds a little romanticized, don't you think?
It does have that element, but Thompson's own background is relevant here.
How so?
He came from a similar place of rootlessness, of feeling like an outsider.
Uh,
So his observations, while they might be a bit romanticized, also come from a place of understanding.
Fair enough. It's definitely a different way of looking at the Angels, not just as a bunch of thugs, but as part of a larger cultural story.
Exactly. A story about rebellion, about being pushed to the margins, and also about how society reacts to those who don't fit in.
Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop, these possible cultural roots. Now let's talk about their image, because let's be honest, the Hells Angels are pretty much synonymous with fear and danger in the public mind.
Right. They have a reputation. And a lot of that comes down to the media. The 60s were a time of social upheaval, and the media was looking for stories that captured that anxiety.
The Hells Angels, with their outlaw image and their, let's say, their enthusiasm for brawling, fit that bill perfectly.
They were easy to sensationalize.
For sure. And then there was that whole Monterey rape case.
Yeah, that was huge.
Even though the charges were eventually dropped, the damage was done.
It cemented their image as brutal criminals.
And the media didn't let up after that. Articles in Time, Newsweek, all these big publications, they kept painting this picture of the Angels as a terrifying force.
A threat to decent society.
And that created this feedback loop, right? The more the media hyped them up, the more the public feared them, and the more the Angels played into that image.
It was a self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah.
And it raises questions about how much of what we know about the Angels is based on reality and how much is media hype.
Totally. It's like that story about the New York Times reporter who basically had to pay the Angels to get access for a story.
Oh yeah, that's a crazy one.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if some reporters were more interested in selling papers than in telling the truth.
It definitely makes you question the whole narrative, doesn't it? Okay, so we've talked about the media's role in shaping public perception, but what about the reality on the inside? Thompson's book gives us a glimpse behind the curtain. So what was it actually like to be part of the club?
Well, one thing Thompson emphasizes is the importance of their colors. You know, the jackets with the Hells Angels insignia.
Oh yeah, those are iconic.
They weren't just a fashion statement. They were a symbol of belonging, of brotherhood. It was like wearing your loyalty on your sleeve.
Literally. But was it all just tough guy posturing, or was there more to it?
Thompson mentions that there were artists, intellectuals, even a secretary among them. Right, like Gut, who wanted to be a commercial artist,
Yeah.
and Ronnie, who handled the Oakland chapter's paperwork.
So it wasn't all just brawls and beer.
Apparently not.
Uh,
There were layers to their personalities, just like with any group.
okay, that's interesting. But still, there's no denying the violence associated with the Hells Angels. Thompson writes about their brawls, their love of weapons. It's hard to reconcile that with these supposedly nuanced personalities.
It's a fascinating contradiction, isn't it? Were they truly dangerous psychopaths, as some believed? Or was there something more to their psychology? To understand that, we need to look at specific events, like the Laconia riot and the Bass Lake incident. Both are really telling.
Oh yeah, those are wild stories. Let's start with Laconia. It felt like that whole situation was a powder keg waiting to explode. The public was on edge, the media was hyping it up.
And then there were those come to the riot signs.
Oh yeah, who thought that was a good idea? It was like they were inviting chaos.
It's a perfect example of how fear and expectation can become self-fulfilling prophecies. The interesting thing is, even now, there are conflicting accounts of what actually happened at Laconia. The police claimed near anarchy, while the Angels downplayed their role in the chaos. So who knows what really went down?
Right, a real he said, she said situation. And then you have Bass Lake, which is almost the complete opposite of Laconia.
Totally different vibe.
If Laconia was about chaos, Bass Lake was about this weird, uneasy peace.
It could have easily turned into another riot, but it didn't.
And I think a lot of credit goes to Tiny Baxter, the sheriff of Madera County. He knew he was dealing with a volatile situation and walked this really fine line to prevent things from escalating.
He was definitely playing with fire.
And then there's that great anecdote about the beer vendor, right? Completely unintentionally, he ended up calming things down at a crucial moment.
Just by doing his job. It shows how unpredictable these encounters could be. The Angels definitely had a capacity for violence, but they weren't always eager to unleash it. It depended on the circumstances, the people they were dealing with.
A lot of factors at play. Okay, we've talked about their origins, the media frenzy, and some of the internal contradictions within their culture. But there's one more piece of the puzzle I'm really curious about. Their relationship with the counterculture movement of the 60s. It's like these two worlds collided for a while, and neither one knew quite what to make of the other.
It's such a strange mix. You have the Hells Angels, these symbols of rebellion and toughness, hanging out with Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters.
That's a wild image. LSD and leather jackets.
For a brief moment, it seemed like they were on the same side, united against the establishment, against conformity.
I can see the appeal for both sides. Intellectuals and radicals saw the Angels as these authentic rebels, living outside the rules.
And the Angels probably enjoyed the attention, the notoriety.
And then there's Allen Ginsberg. Even he was drawn to them, trying to understand them, maybe even influence them.
It's hard to imagine a more unlikely pairing, the beat poet and the biker gang. But it speaks to this idea that even in a world of huge differences, there's a possibility for dialogue, for connection.
It's a hopeful thought. But that connection didn't last, did it? The Angels' attack on the anti-war protest in Oakland pretty much ended any illusions of a true alliance.
Yeah, that was a turning point. They firmly aligned themselves on the opposite side of the counterculture.
Which makes you wonder what they were really after all along. Were they true revolutionaries or just opportunists looking for a good time?
It's a question that goes to the heart of who the Hells Angels really were. Were they victims of their own image, or were they always the brutes the world perceived them to be?
That's a question that's going to stay with us as we keep digging deeper into Thompson's book.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? And like you said, we're just getting started. There's so much more to uncover in Thompson's book. I think one of the things that struck me was their whole attitude towards work, or maybe lack of attitude is a better way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, the 9-to-5 grind wasn't exactly their thing. Thompson even mentions that a lot of them relied on stuff like unemployment insurance, almost like a badge of honor.
Right, like avoiding the straight world. They'd rather spend their time on those epic runs that Thompson describes. Huge gatherings, tons of drinking, just pushing boundaries. Sounds pretty wild.
You can practically smell the exhaust fumes and hear the engines roaring just reading about it. But was it really all just chaos? I mean, there had to be some kind of structure, right? Especially with a group as large and, well, notorious as the Hells Angels.
Oh, absolutely. It
What?
wasn't just pure anarchy. Thompson talks about the role of chapter presidents, guys like Sonny Barger from Oakland. They held a lot of authority.
Makes sense. Even rebels need some kind of leadership.
Exactly. Someone to maintain discipline, to negotiate with the outside world, to protect the club's reputation. It shows this real tension within the Hells Angels, this pull between individual freedom and the need to belong to something bigger.
And you see that tension playing out in other parts of their lives, too, like their relationships with women, for example.
Hmm.
On the one hand, Thompson writes about this sense of camaraderie, almost a family vibe. But on the other hand, there's a clear power dynamic at play.
Yeah, it's a complicated dynamic for sure. You see these moments of genuine affection, but then there's also this undeniable misogyny. It's a good reminder that even groups who pride themselves on rebellion are still products of their time.
It's a bummer, but it's true. Progress isn't always a straight line, I guess. So we've got this complicated relationship with work, with women, but there's one more thing that really stood out to me that I want to talk about, their fascination with guns.
Yeah, that's hard to ignore. They took their arsenal pretty seriously. It was almost an extension of their identity. Thompson talks about Magoo, a member who was like a walking encyclopedia of firearms. It's a little chilling, honestly.
And the Nazi symbolism they used.
Right. It's disturbing, to say the least. They claimed it was just to shock people, but I don't know. It definitely crossed the line for a lot of folks.
It makes you question how much we can really understand them, you
Right.
know, even with Thompson's insider perspective. Okay, so we've talked about the complicated relationships with work, women, with violence, with the counterculture, and now even with, well, disturbing imagery like that. It's a lot. But I keep coming back to this idea that the Hells Angels were like a mirror, reflecting all the complexities and contradictions of America in the 60s.
I totally agree. They embodied this desire for freedom, this rejection of authority, but also this capacity for violence. They really were a product of their time, weren't they?
Absolutely. Speaking of reflections, remember that story about Allen Ginsberg trying to connect with the angels? It feels almost unbelievable. The beat poet, famous for peace and love, hanging out with, the Hells Angels.
I know, it's wild. But it wasn't just a quick meet and greet. Ginsberg was genuinely drawn to them, fascinated by their energy, their outsider status. He even wrote a poem for them.
Wow, I didn't know that. It's
Yeah.
like he was trying to bridge this massive cultural gap. Crazy to think about.
It's a powerful reminder that even in a world of like extreme differences, there's always the potential for dialogue, for at least trying to understand each other.
So where do we go from here? We've covered their origins, the media frenzy, their internal culture, the violence, their clashes with the outside world, even touched on like LSD and Allen Ginsberg. It's a lot to process, that's for sure. But one thing's clear, this deep dive into the Hells Angels has been anything but boring.
That's an understatement. It's been a trip, that's for sure. And I think we've raised more questions than we've answered. But like, isn't that kind of the point of a deep dive? It's about challenging assumptions, getting a little uncomfortable, maybe even changing our minds about things.
And I think it's about recognizing a part of ourselves in, even the most unlikely of figures. The Hells Angels were rebels, but who hasn't felt that pull between wanting to be free and wanting to belong?
The universal struggle. And the Hells Angels, with all their contradictions and complexities, they really put that struggle on full display. Okay, I'm ready for more. Where do we go next in Thompson's book?
Well, Thompson spends a lot of time talking about those epic runs we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Those gatherings were legendary, both for their craziness and, like you said, for the potential for things to go really wrong.
Yeah, the runs, they are a huge part of the Hells Angels' identity, for sure. A way to solidify their brotherhood, blow off some steam and just kind of flip off mainstream society.
But it wasn't just about mindless mayhem, was it? Thompson writes about all these rituals, this code of conduct that governed everything, how they rode, how they interacted with each other. It's fascinating.
It's like they created their own world with its own laws, its own sense of order, even within the chaos. It's really interesting.
But that order was often maintained with violence, right? Thompson doesn't shy away from that. He describes fights breaking out, sometimes over, like really small things.
Yeah.
It's almost like violence was a way to enforce the rules, to settle disputes, to keep everyone in line.
It's a disturbing thought, but it makes sense. Violence was just a constant in their lives, and it wasn't always directed outward. It was used to control each other, too, a way to ensure compliance, to punish those who, didn't play by the rules.
So they craved freedom, but enforced conformity with violence. Talk about a paradox. It makes the whole picture even more complicated, doesn't it?
Yeah. It challenges that romantic image of the outlaw biker. Behind the leather jackets and the tough guy persona, there's a lot of darkness, a lot of pain, and I think a deep yearning for something more.
It's a good reminder that freedom isn't always what it seems. It often comes with a price.
Right, and sometimes The price is too high.
So we can judge them, label them as criminals or whatever.
Mm.
But I think Thompson's book really pushes us to see them as human beings, to understand what made them tick. And that's the point of this deep dive, isn't it? It's not about right or wrong. It's about understanding.
Absolutely. It's about challenging our assumptions, getting a little uncomfortable, and maybe coming away with a little more empathy, even for those who seem so different from us. Okay, I'm ready to wrap this up. Where do we go from here?
Well, we've explored their history, their culture, their psychology, how they were portrayed, and even their, let's say, experimental side. But ultimately, this deep dive has been about more than just the Hells Angels. It's been about the complexities of human nature, the longing for freedom, the search for belonging, the struggle to find meaning in a world that doesn't always make sense.
And I think Thompson, with his unique perspective and his incredible storytelling, really captures that struggle.
He definitely does. So, to everyone listening, I hope you'll walk away from this with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to keep exploring, and maybe even a little bit of understanding for those who live on the edges of society.
We've all got our own journeys, our own struggles. And sometimes the most unlikely figures can teach us a lot about ourselves.
Well said. Keep those minds open, keep those engines revving, and keep searching for those hidden truths out there. Until next time, happy deep diving.
You know, as we're wrapping up here, one thing I keep thinking about is this tension between the angels' like fierce independence and their like deep need for belonging. It just seems like a contradiction, but it's really at the heart of, who they were.
It really is. They were rebels who rejected mainstream society. They embraced the open road, but they also really craved that camaraderie, that structure, the brotherhood the club provided. Like, they were always navigating this push and pull between freedom and, well, constraint.
And you see it everywhere in Thompson's book, like their attitude toward work, their relationships with women, even their use of violence. It all points back to this struggle to define themselves as individuals, but also as members of this group.
It's really fascinating. Psychologically, I mean. Makes you think, is true freedom even possible when you're part of such a tight-knit structure? A hierarchical one, too. I don't know. It's like they were trying to create their own little world with its own rules, its own order. But they couldn't escape the fact that they were still living in a larger system, a system that they ultimately couldn't control.
And that feeling of being trapped, of being like both inside and outside the system at the same time, probably contributed to a lot of the anger and frustration. I mean, imagine, it's like constantly pushing up against those boundaries, trying to carve out a space for yourself when the world around you just doesn't get it.
One of the things Thompson talks about that really struck me was the angels experimenting with LSD. It just seems so out of place with this image we have of them, the tough guys on bikes.
Right. It seems so unexpected.
Yeah.
But it was the 60s. LSD was legal back then. It was like this new frontier of consciousness. And it appealed to their sense of adventure, right? That willingness to push things to the limit, explore the unknown.
But it wasn't just about, getting high. Thompson seems to think some of them were really searching for something deeper, some kind of spiritual thing, or maybe trying to escape from some inner demons.
I think so. For some of them, I mean, they had these really intense experiences, like transformative even, where they felt like they were seeing the world and themselves in a whole new way.
But of course, for others, it didn't go so well. It was just a bad trip full of paranoia and fear.
Yeah. It shows you that even the strongest drugs can't really offer a permanent escape, can they?
Oh.
There's no easy way out of facing, the complexities of life.
And it highlights the risks of, well, any kind of extreme behavior, I guess. The Angels' whole thing was about pushing those limits, defying conventions, but that often came at a cost. Thompson talks about the arrests, the injuries, the relationships that fell apart.
It's a good reminder that freedom isn't always what it seems. It's not always glamorous. There's responsibility that comes with it. And sometimes, it can even be self-destructive.
Yeah. So it really challenges that whole romanticized image we have of the outlaw biker, the carefree rebel. It's easy to forget there's a human being under all that leather and those tattoos.
And I think that's what makes Thompson's book so important. It forces us to confront that humanity, to see them as individuals, each with their own stories and motivations.
It's about empathy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what a deep dive like this is all about, isn't it? It's not about passing judgment or finding those easy answers. It's about challenging our own ideas, being open to different perspectives, and embracing that messy, complicated reality of what it means to be human.
Okay. Well, I think we've come to the end of the road for this deep dive into the world of the Hells Angels. I hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did. We've gone through their history, their culture, even their psychology. And I hope you walked away with a little more curiosity, a willingness to question what you think you know about the world and even about yourself.
We've all got something to learn from those who dare to be different, even especially from those who live on the edges of society. The Hells Angels were a product of their time, sure, but their story is ultimately a human one, and those are the stories that, well, those are the stories that stick with us, aren't they?
Well said. That's a great note to end on. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep those minds open, and happy deep diving.